Good to have you here this evening. Glad all of you are able to be with us as we continue our studies in 1 Timothy. I'd like to turn to chapter 5, please. We'll be beginning in verse 23 in just a moment as we continue the instructions that Paul gives to the young evangelist Timothy. And we're in pretty much the last section of the book with just some general instructions about various things that Timothy should teach in his work as an evangelist. We have, in this section, the last half of chapter 5, we've talked about the instructions that Timothy was to teach about honoring elders. Talked about the fact that when there are accusations, it must be at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. We discussed the fact that certain sins must be rebuked publicly, but that sin must be dealt with without prejudice or without partiality, that he should avoid being involved in other people's sins. So those are some general instructions that we have, a lot of them having to do with dealing with sin in these verses, verse 17 through the end of the chapter. Tonight we'll begin with verse 23 and hopefully get into chapter 6, some other discussions that he teaches Timothy. Questions or comments anybody has to verse 22? All right, let's go ahead and read some verses here at the end of chapter 5. We'd like to read chapter 5, verse 23 through 25. Chapter 5, verse 23 to the end of the chapter for us, please. Who'd like to read that for us, please? Bill, please.
No longer drink only the water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake, for your frequent infirmities. Some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but those of some men follow later. Likewise, the good works of some are clearly evident, and those that are otherwise cannot be hidden.
All right. So verse 23, what problem does he say that Timothy has? We're in question number 38. What problem did he say that Timothy had in verse 23? Go.
And no longer drink just water, but drink some wine for his stomach's sake.
All right. He's got some kind of stomach problem, and he says frequent infirmities. Okay. Now, we're not told anything more about it than that, but the instructions that Paul gives him is to not drink water, but to use a little wine for his stomach's sake. So there's several things we could talk about. We discussed the subject of wine earlier when we talked about the elders, so let's just focus on the situation here with Timothy. First of all, how would you respond to someone who says, as some people have, that this justifies social drinking? That here Paul's telling Timothy, drink some wine, therefore it's okay for us to practice social drinking. How would you respond to that? Sure.
I told somebody that since they have frequent headaches, they might try some ibuprofen. Nobody would think that I was saying that everybody should just be eating ibuprofen all the time for no particular good reason. He's taking this as an assistance to a health problem that he's got, instead of what he was doing before his health problem, which was just drinking water.
Okay, so we shouldn't just get together and have an ibuprofen party. Okay, so everybody understands that, if you're thinking clearly at all, but there are lots of different substances that may have a good use for medical purposes for somebody who has frequent infirmities, stomach or whatever it may be. The things that you take to deal with that you wouldn't do just for the enjoyment of it, certainly not socially, and in fact might even not be legal to do it that way, because some medications are to be used only with a prescription from a doctor and so on. So we understand that concept. And so as we're dealing here, Paul is telling Timothy he has a particular problem, and that drinking wine rather than water might help him with it. Okay, fine, but that doesn't justify drinking wine for social purposes or just as a beverage or just for pleasure or whatnot. Other comments on that aspect of it or on why Paul told Timothy this? Other discussion on it? Okay, what can we learn from the fact that Paul gave this instruction to Timothy. What are some lessons we can learn about health problems in general, or any comments you have on the passage?
That it's okay to seek medical help.
All right, so one thing is obvious that, first of all, sometimes Christians have health problems, don't they? In fact, even preachers have health problems. Sometimes people have the idea that, some people say, well, you just trust God and pray to God and He'll take care of it. Well, no, there are things that we can do to help us deal with our health issues. Other people would say, well, Paul could do miracles. Why didn't he do a miracle and heal him? And what would you say to that? Why would you respond to somebody who would say, like many so-called faith healers say today, that you can trust God for a miracle and send them a donation, and God will do a miracle and take away your health problems? How would you respond? What would this have to do with that? How would that help us there? Rick?
So Paul, when he had an infirmity himself that he prayed to have taken care of, but yet he was willing to accept the fact that he was going to have to live with that infirmity the rest of his life. He was willing to do whatever the Lord willed.
Okay, so 2 Corinthians chapter 12 talks about Paul had a thorn in the flesh. He prayed about it and God did not take it away. So miracles were not done, even in the age when they existed. They were not done just for to solve all the problems of God's people. We've discussed other times that miracles existed as evidence, supernatural evidence to confirm a message to be from God. And if that purpose was not accomplished, then there would be no miracle would be accomplished. And so Paul didn't do a miracle for his own health problem or for Timothy's health problems or Epaphroditus or other people that we have read about who were faithful Christians but nevertheless had health problems. So faith healers who say that miracles are here today to take away your health problems are simply, it simply never was true, and it certainly isn't true today now that miracles have ceased. Okay, so we can understand those things, those principles from the passage. But on the other hand, as Jason pointed out, it is proper to use treatments for our health problems. So it's a scriptural thing to do, and here we have an example of it. Okay, other comments? Anybody? Anything else on verse 23? As I mentioned, I gave you several other assignments about drinking wine and those kinds of things, but we discussed all of that pretty much in the discussion of the qualifications of elders, unless somebody has something else. All right, the last couple verses then, in chapter 5, and the last question on the chapter, verse 24 and 25, he talks about some men's sins are evident, preceding them to judgment, and some follow later, and then some good works are evident, and some cannot be hidden. So what's he talking about when he talks about sins that precede men to judgment in contrast to those that follow? What are your thoughts on that? Sins that precede the judgment versus sins that follow later. Terry.
The idea of proceeding is that they're conspicuous. People know about them.
Okay, so you notice it says that they're clearly evident, and the same thing for the good works in verse 25. So some sins that people commit, other people can know about it. Or some good works that people do, other people know about it. Some are evident, but some are not evident. Some people commit sins that other people don't know about. So if you know about it, then it precedes into judgment. That is, it's done even before the judgment day. People know about the sin, but some sins nobody else will know until the judgment day. And the same thing for good works. Some people do good works that other people don't know anything about, but you'll know at the judgment day. Other good works people do, you may know about. What's the point? Why does he bring this up? Terry?
Well, there's no avoiding. There's no avoiding the accounting for your sin, or there's no avoiding there's no loss if nobody else knows about the good work that you're doing. God knows.
Okay, so sin or good works, either way, are going to be rewarded. If in this life your sin might be known, and there might be some consequences for it. You may, if you commit a crime, you may have to go before the court and maybe even pay a fine or go to jail or whatever. Or if it's a sin that is known in the congregation, you may be disciplined by the congregation, and so on. That might happen preceding the judgment. But if it doesn't happen, if nobody ever knows anything about what you did, don't think you're going to get away with it, because it will still be there, facing you, following you at the judgment day. And the same thing for other people. Okay? Other comments? What benefit is that? Or what concern is that for us to know that? Velma.
That you would have opportunity to correct that before the judgment.
Okay, for one thing, if it's our own sin, certainly we can correct it before the judgment. And for that matter, if it's somebody else's sin, and we can help them. We know about their sin. And he's talked about that a whole lot in the chapter, hasn't he? He really, I think, is relating back to a lot of things he's talked about in the chapter. That when we know about somebody's sin, there are things we can do about it. Whether it's our own sin or somebody else's sin, there's things we can do to help that person. But if we, going back, for example, to the point about 2 or 3 witnesses. Suppose we think somebody may have committed a sin, but we don't have any evidence for it. We can't prove it. We may think it, but we can't prove it. Well, is the person going to get away with it? Do we have to say, well, I guess he just lucked out? No, because God knows. And if he committed the sin, God will take care of that. So we don't have to resolve every accusation of sin in this life. Now, if we have the evidence, if we have the 2 or 3 witnesses, then we need to deal with it. But if we don't have the evidence, then there may be nothing we can do. And sometimes that may be frustrating. Well, there are other comments I have, but anybody else have other comments? How does that help you when you look at our society today? Is there any encouragement to you in what we see around us today? What are the things that are happening in our society that you think it looks to me like somebody's getting away with something here? Is that happening today? It sure happens to me. It sure happens to me. I said, this doesn't look right. I think somebody's doing something here that's not right. I don't have to solve all those problems.
There will be people that will use the passage that says, don't judge me, only God will judge me.
Well, that's...
We can see, and I think I see in this verse here that whether I judge, and I understand what that passage is meaning by, by your own sins, don't put down somebody else before, but we are going to be judged. Mm-hmm. And if you catch somebody in a sin, you can to help them out like that.
Right, exactly. But yes, and people try to make excuses and try to say, don't judge, but they misunderstand those scriptures. But regardless, even in the cases where we can't make a judgment, and there are cases where we cannot properly make a judgment because we don't have the evidence. And as I say, that might be frustrating to us, and to look at people around us that we suspect of being in sin or even know being in sin, but there may be nothing we can do about it. But God will take care of it. The flip side of that is that good that we may do, that nobody knows about, or that maybe people don't give us credit for it. Okay, it's all right. I don't need credit in this life for it, because I know God knows. And in fact, Jesus said, don't let your right hand know what your left hand does. We shouldn't be doing good works for the sake of people patting us on the back. We should do what's good because it's good and because it pleases God. God will take care of those things. So some things will be taken care of in this life, and some things will wait till the judgment. But either way, good or bad, God's going to make sure that justice will prevail. Okay? Other comments on verse 24 and 25 and how that kind of wraps up some of the things he says in the chapter and the lessons that we might learn for ourselves today. Anybody else? All right, let's move on into chapter 6 then. As we go into chapter 6, we have another group. We talked about a number of different groups so far. We talked about the elders, we talked about deacons, older men, older women, younger women. Talked about widows. Now we're going to talk about a different group. In fact, we're going to talk about a couple more of them before we get very far into chapter 6. And the one we're going to talk about in first part of the chapter is servants and their relationship to masters. So let's read verses 1 and 2, and we'll see how far we get. Who would like to read chapter 6, verses 1 and 2 for us, please? Chapter 6, Steve, verse 1 and 2, please.
Let as many bondservants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and his doctrine may not be blasphemed. And those who have believing masters, let them not despise them because they are brethren, but rather serve them, because those who are benefit are believers and beloved. Teach and exhort these things.
All right. So here we're discussing, he says, those who are bondservants or servants, depending on your translation and so on, and their relationship to masters. And what does he say? We're in chapter 6 now, obviously. Question number 1. What does he tell the servants to do? What's his instruction to servants? Verse 1.
Serve them wholeheartedly.
All right, to serve the wholeheartedly. Okay. What else does he say? Frank.
To regard their masters as worthy of all honor.
Okay. Show your master, treat them as though they're worthy of all honor. Wait a minute. There's that word honor again. So we've seen it different ways, haven't we? With regard to the widows, what did it mean? Honoring the widows meant?
Support and sustain.
All right, support them financially, take care of their needs. But we talked about the elders, it was double honor. Financial honor and what else? The other kind of honor was what?
Support.
And this support was the one kind. That was the widows. But the other kind is
Respect.
respect. Okay. So what kind is it here?
Respect.
Okay, it's respect, isn't it? He certainly isn't saying that servants are supposed to financially support their masters. So he's talking about respect. So we see that word 3 different times now in these last, these 2 chapters. Okay, so we talk about respecting. Servants should respect their masters, count them worthy of all honor, and other passages. And I ask you to look at some other passages. But I have some other passages. Question number 3 about servants in regard to masters. What are some other passages that talk about this? Anybody? Frank.
Colossians 4:1. Paul writes, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving.
3:22.
Okay, I don't think you were in 4:1 there, Frank.
Oh, I guess so. 3:22. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord.
Okay, and then chapter 4, verse 1 then does talk about the masters giving the servants what is just and fair. All right, so we have other scriptures, and some we've studied in this class at times in the past, teaching servants that they are to be obedient to their masters sincerely, as though they are serving God. Okay, and there's lots of other scriptures about it as well. Okay, so here he's giving instruction to Timothy that this is what he's to teach the servants to do. But what is the point about the name of God and the doctrine may not be blasphemed? What does it have to do with it? The last part of the verse. Honor your masters so the name of God and his doctrine is not blasphemed. Sharon. Sharon.
Well, anytime a Christian doesn't behave the way they should, other people can look at that and say, they're a Christian, look at the way they're behaving. Why should I be a Christian? And so our example has brought dishonor on our Heavenly Father. And so specifically, the application here is to the servants, that if they won't treat their master properly, either the master or anybody else who knows about it has any reason to want to be a Christian like they are.
Okay. Daryl?
Also, servants might have the idea that they have a master in God, and that's the one they obey, and not so much, and they might think, since that's my master, I don't have to obey you, speaking of their earthly masters. Reminds me of the one time my parents got a babysitter for us, and I actually told the woman, "You're not my parent, I don't have to obey you." But if servants in that day took that view and disobeyed their masters, and people started noticing these servants who follow Christ are rebellious and disobedient, that would be an occasion for blasphemy.
Okay, so today, in our society, we don't have slaves as such. So what application would there be to us today? Is there an application for us here? And, well, we'll get to verse 2 in a minute, but even on this point about honoring your master and the doctrine of God not being blasphemed, what application would that have for us? Okay. The truth is, and I think this to me, this is the proper way to look at it. You are a servant for the time that you've been hired to work. During that period, you are a servant. Now, you have the blessing of being able to change jobs in this society if you are able to do so and choose to do so. But if you're hired to work, say, 8-9 hours a day on a job, for that period of time, you're a servant. And what this says is exactly the way it ought to be done. And if you don't do your work diligently, if you are slack off, if you sit around and talk and instead of doing your work, it reflects unfavorably on God and on the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Then your conduct and your attitude also might be a step to teaching somebody else.
Okay, so that comes back to the honor aspect of it, not just the fact that you're going through the motions, but you're doing it with a respectful attitude and honoring the one who is your master will be a favorable reflection on the gospel. Okay? Other comments? And how about verse 2 then? He says that some of them may have believing masters. And if that's the case, what should they do? What should you do if your master is a believer? Terry.
Your service should be motivated by the fact that you are brothers. And you want to do good to him and serve him and benefit him by what you can do for him.
Okay. So there might be a tendency to resent the fact that your master is a Christian. But Paul said instead of that, you should view it as that they're brethren and that they are beloved. The Christians should love one another, not resent one another. So rather than being upset with the fact that your master is a Christian, you should serve them even more diligently with love. All right? Comments on that? Can you think of an example in the Bible of a Christian who had a master who was a Christian?
Philemon.
Okay. Philemon. Now, Onesimus was not a Christian when he escaped, apparently, from Philemon, but he was converted by Paul, and Paul sent him back. Now, Onesimus has a Christian who is his master. Okay? So there's a situation. So rather than resenting the fact that he has master who is a Christian, it's all the more reason to serve him. What might be some benefits of having a master who's a Christian? In what way might it be a benefit, actually, to have a Christian as a master?
Maybe treated more fairly.
Okay, if he's really a Christian, you're going to get better treatment, aren't you? Than you would expect, at least in general, from a person who's not a Christian, that he ought to treat you, back to Colossians 4 and verse 1 and so on. He ought to treat properly, knowing that he has a master and so on. And there should be a relationship of love. So rather than being resentful because your master is a Christian, you should appreciate the benefit of having that kind of relationship. Okay, other comments?
Would make it easier to serve the Lord that way.
Okay, all right, and Frank?
Well, that's what I was going to say, that make it more convenient, easier to make plans for worship services and working together in the Lord.
Okay, and again, not having slave masters as such today, but the same thing would be true on a job today. Wouldn't it be preferable if your employer was a Christian? Wouldn't that make it be a benefit in your relationship and in your work? To hopefully, presumably, if he really is living as a Christian, you get along better. And he should treat you with proper concern that he ought to, and makes it easier for you to serve him, easier to serve God, and so on. Okay, other comments on verses 1 and 2, and what he says about slaves and servants and masters in those verses. Anybody? Sharon?
I think we can see how clever Satan is at tempting us. And here's this servant. If he had a master who wasn't a Christian, then Satan could tempt him to say, well, why should I obey him? He's not serving God. But now he's actually serving someone who is a Christian, has all these benefits, and Satan still might be tempting him to say, he's no better than I am, why should I have to obey him? And in our lives, too, Satan can twist anything to be a temptation, and we have to remember to work hard to keep our attitude godlike.
Okay. So, Christians, sometimes in our relationships in this life, sometimes we're subject to authority. Our responsibility, it's a legitimate authority. And understand, I'm talking about legitimate authority like the civil government or parents with their children, husbands and wives, and in this case, servants and masters, legitimate authority. We are responsible to obey. It's not an excuse to say I don't have to obey because he's not a Christian, or I don't have to obey because he is a Christian. We are responsible to submit. On the other hand, sometimes as Christians, we have authority. Sometimes we are in the leadership role. And when that's the case, again, we need to act as Christians and treat those under our authority with proper concern and respect and even love, as the passage says. Okay, other comments on verses 1 and 2 and his discussion about servants and masters. Anybody? Terry?
I have the question that I've heard this discussed, that this is not a slave circumstance, but a bondservant, which you place yourself in that situation, or your debt might place you in that situation. But that slavery, like we had in this country, is akin to the kidnapping that is against God's law. And that it's not necessarily referring here to someone who enslaves somebody to themselves, but that they are a master over them, and the circumstance may be that, they have to pay off their debt, so they have to do that. Or like bondservants came to this country, they made themselves a servant to somebody that would pay their way to come here from England or someplace, and they agreed to serve that person for so long, and they couldn't leave there because of the agreement they had with them. Have you any comments about that?
Okay. Let's see if we can make maybe some brief comments on the idea of slaves. We have already discussed Terry's point in chapter 1 about kidnapping. If a person obtained a slave by force, violence, that would be a sin. Pure and simple. That's all there is to it. That would be a sinful way to obtain a slave. And of course, mistreating someone who is subject to you would be sinful as well. Does that mean that all slavery is wrong? It's wrong in our society because it's illegal. But in the societies where it was legal, was it always wrong? Was it be sinful for always for a Christian to be a slaveholder? Always, or not? Okay, well, sure.
Not always, because it was legal to have slaves under certain circumstances in the Old Testament as well.
Okay, so we've already got one situation where Onesimus was a slave to Philemon. We've already got one situation in the scriptures. And Paul did not say, let him go. He, to some extent, hinted that he might want to do that, but he didn't command him to do that. So, no, it's not necessarily wrong. And back to Sharon's point, sometimes a person would, Terry made the point, indebt himself to a master, but that was still a master-slave relationship in some cases. In other words, yes, you're paying off a debt, but still you're owned by that person until the debt is paid off. Now, there was such thing as the year of Jubilee and so on, and every so often slaves were set free, but only if it was a fellow Israelite. The rules were different if there was not an Israelite, but still you had to treat them properly. So there were situations when taking someone as a slave was actually doing them a favor. You were actually helping them out because they were in a financial bind. They couldn't have any other way to get a job, provide for themselves or their family. And if you were to take them as a slave, they would agree to it, yes. But then they're slaves. After they've agreed to it, they're slaves. But you've done it for their good, not just out of cruelty or hatred. So that's a long study. It might be worthwhile. Maybe when we get to the book of Philemon, we can talk about it some more. But that's my understanding. Other comments? Darryl.
From my reading, this has been my thought, and I just looked at a few different pages real quickly here to verify my memory. Most slaves in the Roman Empire were not of the indentured servant kind. Most were captives from war, that kind of thing. In fact, I think probably the vast majority of them were. So I don't know what to do with that, and understanding the New Testament teaching on it. But in my mind, there's still more to think about to figure out how to fit the instruction to Christian masters with principles of how we treat one another.
Okay, well, let me just say this in regard to your comment about slaves in the Roman Empire. From what I've read and heard, generally speaking, slaves were treated like dirt in the Roman Empire. I mean, it was disgusting the way they were treated. I mean, they were worse than property. If a man wanted to kill a slave on just practically any pretense, he could do so. The treatment was awful, from what I've read and heard. So, on the one hand, Christians would have a serious problem either being a slave or a slaveholder in the Roman Empire because of that. But that didn't mean you had to treat your slaves that way. Just because other people didn't mean that you had to. You could still treat them right, the way Colossians 4:1 and so on said that you should, and like Philemon was to do with Onesimus and so on. So, absolutely, slavery often involved terrible things. Slavery in our country involved terrible things at times. Because slaves, most of them were captured, brought here against their will, sold at I don't want you anymore, sell the husband here and the wife there and the kids over here, separating families, and just plain sinful mistreatment. Not to mention beatings and other kinds of things. But it wasn't always that way. You can read it even in the Bible and other passages of servants that were treated with great respect. Some servants became like family members and were highly respected and highly loved. So just because some slaves were mistreated and some masters mistreated doesn't mean that they all were that way. It doesn't mean it's all wholesale to be forbidden. Now, again, I'm not encouraging it. I'm not saying I want to go back to it in this country, but just understand when you understand the biblical principles, there has to be some reason why the Bible doesn't just wholesale say slaves should be set free and masters Christians shouldn't have slaves. It doesn't say that. Old Testament and New Testament. No place, to my knowledge, does it say that it's wrong to have slaves. But to mistreat slaves or to take them forcefully would certainly be sinful, and it often happened that way. All right. If you want to do some more thoughts on that, save it for the book of Philemon. We can talk about it some more when we get to that book, if we get to that book. Okay? All right, let's move on. Let's read some more verses. No, we don't have much time. Well, let's go ahead and read 3 through 5, and we'll introduce at least the next subject of false teachers. Who'd like to read verses 3 through 5 for us, please? Chapter 6, verses 3 through 5. Tim.
If anyone teaches otherwise and does not consent to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which accords with godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing, but is obsessed with disputes and arguments over words, from which come envy, strife, reviling, evil suspicions, useless wranglings of men, of corrupt minds, and destitute of truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. From such withdraw yourself.
All right. So what subject we're discussing another group of people, now another kind of person that we need to be concerned about, and Timothy in particular, and what kind of people is that? What's he talking about in verses 3 through 5? Okay, those who teach false doctrine, those who teach error. We've already discussed this earlier in the book. Where else have we talked about this in the book? Question number 5. Where else have we talked about this in the book?
4 and 3.
Okay, the first part of chapter 4 talked about those who taught you can't eat meats, you can't marry, and so on. We discussed that apostasy that would result from that. Where else have we talked about it, Terry?
Chapter 1, 3 through 10.
All right, so he introduced the book with it, didn't he? The very first part of the book talked about the problem of those who teach other doctrines, and teaching other doctrines lead other people astray, teach things that they don't know wannabe teachers when they don't know what they're talking about, and so on. So it appears to me that he's returning to it as he closes the book. Began with it, and he closes with it. The danger of those who teach other doctrines. He'll discuss it again as well in 2 Timothy. So I want us to list some characteristics of false teachers and the effects of it as we study these verses. Maybe it's enough time to just begin it a little bit. What's the first characteristic of a false teacher that he describes in verse 1? And your assignment will be for next week then, to go through the list and make sure you understand all these different things and maybe get other passages. But chapter 6, verse 3, the first characteristic of the kind of person he's talking about is what? Terry.
If I know what you're asking me, the fact that they're teaching a different doctrine.
Okay. So he says they teach otherwise, that is, otherwise from the words of Jesus Christ, and they don't consent to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the doctrine which accords with godliness. So the first thing that you're looking for here is somebody who teaches differently from the doctrine of Christ, and actually opposed, will not consent to the truth. In other words, what he teaches actively opposes what Jesus would teach in his word, that which is according to godliness. Now it says he does not consent to wholesome words. Some of your translations may say sound. So what kind of teaching is wholesome teaching? Wholesome teaching means what?
Pure and true.
Okay, it's pure, it's true, and it's spiritually healthy. So much your spiritual well-being. The doctrine of Jesus Christ is what is not only pure and true, but it's what's beneficial. It's helpful to anyone to teach that and follow the doctrine of Jesus Christ in contrast to that which is opposed to it, which is harmful. All right, so it's according to the teaching of Jesus, and it's according with godliness. That's the doctrine that needs to be taught. Now, it seems to me, this is what I think is happening. He introduces that kind of person in verse 3. Then in verses 4 and 5, he describes some characteristics of that kind of person and some of the effects that happen. I don't believe that everyone who teaches error is going to have every single one of these characteristics. I don't think you have to be able to say, okay, he's got this one, check, 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 check. Okay, he's a false teacher. I don't think that's the point. The point is a person who opposes the doctrine of Christ, teaches a different doctrine, these kinds of things are very likely to characterize him and the results of his teaching. Okay? So these are certain things to be watching out for. But so understand them in your study for next time and understand how we, going back to chapter 5, how we should deal with this kind of thing when we face it. Okay? Questions or comments before we close? Anybody? Okay, thank you.